So today's text is sort of an interesting one, especially the second reading. Okay, the second reading has this really interesting line I want to focus in on, a real truth about humanity that gets pointed out in the book of Romans, and then the gospel really, I think, explains why it's a truth. And that truth is, people will not die for a righteous man, but they might for a good man. Okay, and when they say man, they mean human. Okay, and I think that's a hard truth for people to think through. It's a hard truth for us to accept that, we tend to hold good people higher than great people or righteous people. And I think part of that is because we get so much into valuing the form of something rather than the substance of something. And the gospel almost sets up a little trap to prove that we do this. A trap we fall into when we read last week's lesson and we read this week's lesson. And when I say we, I mean preachers and people in the pews and theologians. We fall into this interesting little trap because we get this weird priming of two very similar stories and we respond to the form of the story, not the substance. Let me explain. Last week was the story of Nicodemus. And it's worth noting that comes right before in the Bible. So if you're just reading the Bible straight through, you hit the story of Nicodemus, and right afterwards you're going to hit the story you just heard, okay? So the Nicodemus story, you're primed. You're told right off the bat, Nicodemus is a guy who's a Pharisee, right? It starts off right like that. And Pharisee conveys that he's a religious leader, he's educated, and he has political power, right? We know that because the Pharisees make up the Sanhedrin are who takes Jesus to Pilate to be killed, right? Maundy, Thursday story, y'all familiar, right? So we have this politically powerful, intellectually intelligent, religiously observant guy who then comes in and asks a whole bunch of sort of silly questions, or at least on the surface are silly, but when you dig into it are actually relatively deep questions about what does it mean to sort of live and die each day and to be born again day by day as we walk forward in Christ. What does it mean to recommit yourself maybe 12 times in a day because you're having a rough day, right? And so you have this sort of legitimate theological conversation. It's worth noting that theologians, and when people read it, we all read it and we see that pretty easily, that there's this legitimate, deep conversation. Then you hit the next story, in which we don't even give the woman a name. This nameless person who's a woman, not just a woman, a Samaritan woman, clearly not educated because she's getting water at the middle of the day. She also sort of has a common sense issue that Kim hinted off on. And why are you getting water in the middle of the day? Everyone gets it when it's cool, either in the morning or the evening. So we paint the person right off the bat. We prime you that this person isn't the smartest, isn't the most righteous, isn't the most best at their common sense, woman who doesn't even deserve to be named. And yet, she asks equally deep theological questions, if not arguably deeper questions. Again, on the surface, they seem sort of silly to be this conversation about water, but you understand, right, that she as a Samaritan has to go up to get her sins forgiven every so often to a mountain. And the big difference is that the Jews think you go to the temple, the Samaritans think you go to the mountain, but they basically have the same sort of rituals of if you did this, then you need to go buy 7 hens and kill them and sacrifice them to God, so on and so forth. They're just mostly arguing over where the sacrifices occur more than anything else. So when he says, I am the living water, what he's saying is that whole sacrificial world is going away. I am here to forgive you all, not in a quid pro quo situation of you sacrifice so many turtle doves that you get this forgiven, but you are forgiven because you are children of God, right? He's hinting at what's going to happen on the cross. And if you follow her responses at first, yeah, she isn't getting it, but she starts to. She starts to understand, which is why she's like, my ancestor Jacob built this well. Are you telling me that what you're going to do is bigger than that? They're not talking about the well, they're talking about the mountain. It's a whole understanding of how forgiveness is sought, that it is not earned, it is given, it is God's grace. They're deep into that sort of theological discussion by the end of it. It's also worth noting, if you look at the life of Nicodemus, putting the discussion aside for a second, if you look at the results, we know that Nicodemus chickens out come Maundy, Thursday, because the Sanhedrin, you have to have a unanimous result to go ahead and have him put to death. And clearly, they got a unanimous result, and Nicodemus was clearly there because he regrets it, John tells us later. Nicodemus regrets it enough, that's why he comes on Holy Saturday to pick up the body of Jesus and get him to a proper tomb. It's worth noting, after he does that, we hear nothing about Nicodemus. He basically vanishes from Christian history, meaning he didn't have a big impact. Her, on the other hand, before we're done with the paragraph, we learn converts all of the Samaritans in her local town, right? Because she goes and she tells them, very imperfectly, right? Because she's like, well, I think he's maybe the Messiah. You catch that in the text, right? She's not sure. She's just sort of like, he told me everything about myself. He says he's the Messiah. You guys might want to go see this guy. And yet, that is what converts him. She becomes this important person in the early church who leads to the conversion of the Samaritans. See, if you look at anything of substance, what she said or what the results were, she's way better than Nicodemus, right? And yet, preachers, theologians, people just reading the Bible, quickly look over her because we fall into the trap the Bible set of priming us one way and then having the substance be a different way. But the Bible does this over and over, right? They give us people that we shouldn't want to listen to, horribly flawed human beings. Moses was a stutterer who had murdered someone, right? Abraham was sort of a door-to-door salesman that kept was such a chicken that every time someone in power would be like, who's that pretty woman with you? Who would be his wife? He'd be like, my sister? God had to intervene multiple times because the guy had a problem with lying. Jesus was the kid born to a teenage mom out of wedlock from the wrong family. The form of these folks scream not the right sort of people from the wrong side of the tracks who have the wrong education, who you probably shouldn't listen to. And yet over and over in the Bible, those are the people that if you listen for the substance, you see what they do, you see the results of what they do, you go ahead and listen to them as people, you become part of the greatest story that's ever existed. See, the Bible's reminding us that the more we value form and the less we value substance, the harder it is to hear God. And there's a lot of practical reasons it's harder. You all know before I was a pastor, I worked in finance. I particularly worked in sort of the fraud division, stopping fraud. Okay? Anti-money laundering was technically the division I worked in. And I'll say, here's the thing about fraudsters. I busted a lot of them. And the thing about fraudsters is this. They have figured out form, right? They're always slick. They always come across like the nicest, best, most awesomest person who's just there to help you, right? The way you bust the fraudster is don't listen to any of the form. Don't look at the nice clothes, the slick language, the niceties. Look at what they're doing. Look at what their substance is. That's how we always caught them. You looked at the details of what was actually occurring, not what they said. It helps keep you safe when you look at substance over form. That's why I tell people with finance, if you're ever involved in a financial instrument and you cannot explain it to your spouse or to your kids, you shouldn't be involved in that financial instrument, right? Because you don't understand the substance of it. You've gotten caught up in the form of all the cool things it might be able to do. It invests me in cryptocurrency. That's awesome. I don't know what that is, but that sounds great, right? It helps keep you safe when you look at it that way. It also helps keep other people safe. Because you know where bigotry often likes to live? It lives in form. It doesn't live in substance. I don't think it's an ironic thing or even a mistake that what we had was a named man and an unnamed woman. Because it plays off our own sense of listening to men over listening to women. It plays off our own patriarchy that existed then and exists now. Every professional woman I've ever known has had a moment in their time where they have stood up and talked and said, you know what would be a great idea? X, Y, Z. And everyone looks at them and goes, okay. And then like 20 minutes later, a dude comes up and he says literally the same thing. And everyone's like, that was brilliant. That was amazing. Right? If you don't know what I'm talking about, ask your wives. This happens because we've primed people to think certain ways. But I could have switched in ethnicity, language, disability, race, any number of other isms that exist out there, and people would have experienced that same thing of simply not being heard, not being named, not being recognized, because people expected the white guy in the room to have the answers, and we're primed to see it that way. Because when you value form over actual substance, it leaves you vulnerable to the isms of this world. Most tragically, though, when we value that form over substance, we miss a whole bunch of amazing conversations. When I first started out in ministry, I would talk to other pastors and I would tell them, they'd say, well, how's your week going? I said, I had this great conversation with this parishioner and we really dug into this theological concept. And the other pastor would look at me and be like, that's the third week in a row you had that. What is with your congregation? They're like the best people ever. And I'm like, I think they're awesome. And then I moved to another congregation. I have the same experience. Another congregation, I have the same experience. Another congregation, I have the same experience. Then it started dawning on me that it wasn't just that I was blessed with amazing congregations, though I am. It's because I listen differently. Because if someone comes to me and says, I don't understand why Nana had to pass, she was amazing, this great person, why did she have to die? I hear the person. I see the pain. I understand that under that is a whole conversation about what does it mean that God is all-powerful, but he also has free will, so did God do this to Nana, or and therefore I didn't have free will, or does free will mean that it just is a senseless death that occurred, and then why would God let it? Does that mean God doesn't have the power to stop it, right? We've all spiraled down this road at some point in our life, or will if you haven't yet. Now, when I hear all that, I hear all the Augustinian arguments and theological stuff, even if you don't say it. Because I don't care about the form in which you say the concern. I care about the concern itself. I don't care if your commas are in the right places or you use the right techno jargon. What I care is what you're trying to say. And therefore, I have beautiful conversations with you guys all the time. Because most people are really deep. They just don't use the proper language the church wants them to use because most people are normal. A lot of pastors and a lot of religious leaders and a lot of folks miss out on that. Because it isn't just the religious folks that have their technocratic language. Finance does, nursing does, healthcare does. Pretty much everywhere I've ever seen, any profession, you guys have your internal languages. When you judge people by those internal languages, rather than by their substance, you're judging by form, not by substance. And therefore you miss out on some amazing conversations. And it makes your world more dull, more gray, less bright, less beautiful, because you're missing the diversity of humans around you. And missing that many of them are struggling with the same thing you are. Even if they seem like completely different people. Because you know what? People are people. As you go out today and you're in your prayer life, take some time in your life and ask yourself, is there someone in your life that you've dismissed, that you're ignored, that you don't see? Someone who's nameless to you? Maybe because you're valuing form over the true substance of the child of God that they are. Amen.